In the heart of Texas, Sheriff John Miller was more than just a lawman. He was a pillar of his community, a trusted enforcer of justice, a devoted husband, and a father to 3 beautiful children. To those who knew him, he was a man of unwavering principles, a man who believed in family, honor, and truth. But behind the scenes, something darker was brewing. It started as a simple test, nothing more than a curiosity about family history, a harmless search for roots. But when John opened that envelope, the world, as he knew it, collapsed in an instant. His eyes scanned the page once, then again. His breath caught in his throat. His pulse pounded in his ears. 3 children, the children he had raised, protected, and called his own. But they weren't his. The numbers on the page told a different story, a truth that could not be undone. Their real father was his own brother. A wave of shock, confusion, and disbelief washed over him. Had there been signs? Had he ignored the whispers of doubt that had occasionally crept into his mind? How long had this betrayal been right in front of him, hidden behind smiles and quiet glances? The weight of the truth pressed down on him, suffocating. His wife, his brother, the 2 people he had trusted more than anyone else, had kept this secret from him for years. Every "I love you," every shared moment, every birthday, every Father's Day, it had all been a lie. Rage took over, a kind of rage that words could not contain, the kind that burns everything in its path, the kind that leaves no room for reason, no space for restraint, the kind that turns a man sworn to uphold the law into something else entirely. Some betrayals can be forgiven, some wounds can heal, but others demand justice of a different kind. And in the silence of that moment, Sheriff John Miller made a choice, one that would change the course of his life forever. A gunshot rang out, then another, and the world would soon learn that even the strongest men can break. What pushed a man sworn to uphold the law to commit a crime that shocked the nation? For years, Sheriff John Miller was the kind of man people turned to in times of crisis. A dedicated officer, a husband, a father, a symbol of justice in his small Texas town. He spent his days enforcing the law, protecting his community, and coming home to the family he cherished. To the outside world, his life was as solid as the badge he wore. But behind the scenes, something darker was lurking. At home, he had what seemed to be the perfect life. His wife, Sarah, was known as a loving mother and a devoted partner. She was warm, kind, always present at community events, always standing by his side. Together, they had built a life of trust, of partnership. At least, that's what John believed. Their 3 children were the heart of their home. John took pride in being their father, in raising them to be strong, honest, and good. He was the one who taught them how to ride their bikes, how to tie their shoes, how to stand tall and do the right thing. But the truth about those children, about his children, was something he never could have imagined. And then there was Michael, John's brother, the man who had been by his side since childhood, the one person who had always been there for him. Michael was family, blood, a bond that nothing could break, or so John thought. But behind the smiles, the shared memories, and the easy conversations, something had been hidden. Something that would shatter everything John believed in. A single DNA test, a piece of paper, and a truth that could not be ignored. How did a simple test unravel a dark family secret and lead to a brutal double murder? John Miller was raised on the values of honor, discipline, and family. Born and raised in a small Texas town, he grew up understanding the importance of hard work and loyalty. His father had been in law enforcement, and from an early age, John knew that he was meant to follow in those same footsteps. Protecting others wasn't just a job, it was a calling. It was a duty he carried with pride. His rise through the ranks was steady and well-earned. From a rookie deputy to sheriff, John built a reputation as a fair but firm officer of the law. The community respected him, trusted him. He was the man who showed up when things went wrong and made sure everything was set right. For years, he was untouchable, a symbol of integrity, a man whose word meant everything. And beside him, through all of it, was his brother, Michael. They had grown up together, fought together, protected each other. The bond they shared was unbreakable, or so it seemed. John had always been the responsible one, the leader. Michael, on the other hand, had always been a little different. More reckless, more charming, able to slip in and out of situations with ease. But no matter what, John never questioned his loyalty. Never once did he believe his own blood could betray him. Then came Sarah. She was beautiful, kind, the kind of woman who lit up every room she entered. They met at a local diner, a chance encounter that turned into something more. For John, it was love from the start. Sarah had a softness that balanced his structured world. She made him feel something he hadn't before, peace. Their love story unfolded like something out of a picture-perfect life. Marriage, children, a home filled with laughter and warmth. John believed he had everything he had ever wanted. The perfect wife, the perfect family, the perfect life. But was it ever truly perfect? Or had the cracks been there all along? Looking back, there were moments that John had brushed aside, moments that had seemed too small to matter at the time. The way Sarah and Michael would exchange glances at family gatherings, the way she would laugh just a little too long at his jokes, the way the children, John's own children, bore an uncanny resemblance to his brother. Had he been blind to it? Or had he simply refused to see? There were whispers, hushed conversations that stopped when John entered the room. A neighbor once made a comment, an innocent observation, or so it had seemed at the time. Those kids sure do look like their uncle. John had laughed it off, brushed it away. But now, those words carried a weight he couldn't ignore. Had the truth been in front of him this whole time? Had he spent years living a lie without ever realizing it? Pushpin, at this point, do you think the sheriff ever suspected something? Drop a comment below and hit like if you're still here. It started with a simple question, one that had lingered in John's mind for years, but had always been dismissed as paranoia. The way Michael interacted with his children, the way they laughed at his jokes, the way they shared his expressions. Was it just a coincidence? Or was there something he hadn't allowed himself to see? He had never truly considered the possibility. Not until that afternoon, when a fellow officer mentioned a case involving a paternity dispute. It was a passing conversation, nothing more, but it stuck with him. A thought crept into his mind, one that he couldn't shake. What if it was meant to be harmless? A simple DNA test, just a way to put his mind at ease. He had no reason to doubt Sarah, no reason to question his own role as a father. But the moment he mailed that test kit, a part of him knew he was opening a door he might never be able to close. The results arrived a few weeks later. He came home from work, tossed the envelope on the kitchen table, and went about his evening. It sat there for hours, unopened, like a silent bomb waiting to explode. But when the house grew quiet, when his wife and children were asleep, he finally picked it up. His fingers ran over the edges. His breath felt heavier than usual. He tore the seal. The numbers blurred in front of him at first. He read them once, then twice. His hands began to tremble. He sat up straighter, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer. 3 children, 3 undeniable results. They weren't his. His brother was their father. The weight of it crushed him, his entire body going cold. He stared at the paper, willing the words to change, wishing for an error. But the truth was right there, spelled out in black and white. Every moment of his life flashed before him. Every bedtime story, every scraped knee, every birthday celebration. Had it all been a lie? How long had this been going on? Since the beginning? Since before his first child was even born? Had he been blind, living a false life, while his own wife and brother carried on behind his back? A sickness twisted in his gut. His breath came in sharp gasps. Rage, disgust, betrayal. It all surged through him like wildfire. His hands clenched the paper so tightly his knuckles turned white. The walls around him blurred. He felt like a fool, like a man who had been played for years and never saw it coming. He shot up from the chair, knocking it over. His pulse pounded in his ears. He needed answers. He needed to hear her say it. He stormed up the stairs, each step heavier than the last. The bedroom door swung open, slamming against the wall. Sarah jolted awake. She saw his face, the rage in his eyes, the paper clutched in his shaking hands. And in that instant, she knew. How long? His voice was low, strained, but the anger beneath it was undeniable. Sarah's face paled. Her lips parted, but no words came out. How long, Sarah? His voice cracked, years of love and trust unraveling into fury. Tears welled in her eyes. She shook her head, her breath coming fast. John, please. Tell me the truth. The paper crumpled in his fist as he stepped closer. You lied to me. Every day. You let me believe. His voice broke, the weight of it all crashing down on him. They were my kids. A sob escaped her lips. She reached for him, but he pulled back like her touch burned him. It wasn't supposed to happen this way, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I never meant to hurt you. The words only made it worse. His jaw clenched so tight it ached. Not supposed to happen this way? He let out a bitter laugh, one that sounded nothing like him. Sarah, how long? Her lips trembled. Since the beginning. The room went silent. John felt the air leave his lungs. Since the beginning. Every moment, every memory, every ounce of love he had poured into his family. It was all built on a lie. His chest rose and fell, his mind racing, drowning in emotions too strong to contain. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the room. He needed space. He needed air. He needed to find Michael. This wasn't over. Not yet. The man he had trusted more than anyone had stolen his life. And now, John Miller was about to take it back. But was this a crime of passion or something far more planned? For hours, John Miller sat alone in his truck, parked on a quiet stretch of road just outside of town. His grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white. The crumpled DNA results lay on the passenger seat beside him, the words still etched into his mind. His brother, his children, his wife. The life he had built was nothing more than an illusion, and now the weight of that truth was pressing down on him with unbearable force. He thought of every moment, every sacrifice. The long shifts, the sleepless nights, the times he'd come home exhausted, but still had the energy to tuck his children into bed. He had given them everything, and now he realized he had been nothing more than an outsider in his own home. His breath was shallow. His mind raced. There was only one person left who could answer for this, Michael. It was just after midnight when John pulled into the driveway of his brother's house. The lights inside were still on. He could see movement through the front window, the shadow of a man walking past. He didn't hesitate. He stepped out of the truck, his heart pounding, his body moving as if he was no longer in control. The door wasn't locked. He pushed it open, the creak of the hinges cutting through the silence of the house. Michael looked up from the couch, a beer in his hand, confusion flashing across his face. But when he saw the expression in John's eyes, he knew. He knew why his brother was there. John, listen, But there was nothing left to say. John's fists connected before Michael could get another word out. The force sent him staggering back, knocking over the coffee table. Beer spilled across the floor. Picture frames crashed from the shelves. A rage unlike anything John had ever known took over, years of betrayal pouring out in violent, uncontrollable fury. You stole my life. John roared, grabbing Michael by the collar and slamming him against the wall. You were my brother. Michael coughed, his hands coming up in defense. "John, please, just let me explain." "Explain." John's voice cracked with anger. "Explain how you slept with my wife? Explain how you father my children." Michael struggled, but John's grip tightened. The walls of the house felt like they were closing in, suffocating, trapping them both in a moment that neither could escape. Then, without thinking, without hesitation, John reached for his gun. The shot rang out, deafening in the small space. Michael's body jerked. A deep red stain spread across his chest as he staggered, his back sliding down the wall. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. His eyes locked onto John's, pleading, shocked, afraid. And then nothing. The silence that followed was suffocating. John stood over his brother, his own chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. The gun felt heavy in his hands, the weight of what he had just done settling in. And then movement. Sarah. She had been there. She had seen everything. John turned, his breath still uneven, his mind clouded. Sarah stood frozen at the foot of the stairs, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. "John," her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, they just stared at each other. And then reality set in. She turned to run. John moved before he could think. The betrayal, the anger, it consumed him, drove him forward. He couldn't let her leave. He couldn't let her call the police, tell the world what he had done. She was as guilty as Michael. She had lied. She had taken everything from him. Another shot echoed through the house. And then silence once again. Blood stained the floor, the walls, the very foundation of the life he had once believed in. John stood there, the gun still in his hand, his breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. His wife lay motionless, just feet from his brother. The betrayal was over. But at what cost? Somewhere in the distance, a phone rang. A voice. Faint. Panicked. 911, what's your emergency? A child's voice, one of his children, shaking, barely able to speak. Please, send help. He's got a gun. John's body went rigid. His mind snapped back to reality. His children. His children had been there. They had seen. They had heard. And now, there was no undoing it. The weight of what he had done crashed over him like a tidal wave. His hands shook. His vision blurred. He staggered back, looking at the destruction before him. The home that had once been filled with love was now a crime scene. The man who had once upheld the law had just broken it in the most irreversible way. And as the distant sound of sirens filled the night air, John knew there was no escaping this. If you've made it this far, like this video, subscribe to this channel, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. The call came in at exactly 12:47 a.m. A young, trembling voice on the other end of the line. Panicked breaths. Stifled sobs. The words barely making it out. Please send help. He shot them. Within minutes, red and blue lights tore through the quiet Texas night. The sheriff's own colleagues, men and women who had once stood by his side, now raced toward his home. Only this time, they weren't responding to a case he was leading. This time, he was the suspect. The moment officers arrived, they knew something was wrong. The front door stood ajar, a slow creak echoing as the wind pushed against it. The house was eerily silent, except for the faintest sound of someone breathing inside. Guns drawn, the officers entered, their boots crunching against glass and debris scattered across the floor. And then they saw it. 2 bodies. Blood pooled beneath them, already beginning to dry. The wife. The brother. Lifeless. The air was thick with gunpowder, the metallic scent of death clinging to every surface. And then, standing in the middle of it all, Sheriff John Miller. He didn't run. He didn't resist. His gun was still in his hand, his body frozen like a man trapped inside his own mind. His eyes, dark and empty, stared at nothing. He looked past the officers, past the flashing lights, past the horror of what he had done. When they ordered him to put down the weapon, he didn't hesitate. The gun clattered against the wooden floor, the sound loud in the heavy silence. "Turn around. Hands behind your head." He complied, moving as if in a daze, the handcuffs clicking into place around his wrists. The same cuffs he had used on countless criminals before. Now they belonged to him. As they led him outside, the reality of the situation began to unfold. Neighbors stood outside in stunned silence, some covering their mouths, others whispering in disbelief. This wasn't just any suspect being taken into custody. This was their sheriff, the man they had trusted, the man who had sworn to protect them. And now he was being placed into the back of a police car like any other murderer. Back at the station, the crime scene was being meticulously processed. Every detail, every inch of that house was now evidence. The forensic team worked through the night, documenting everything. 2 gunshot wounds, one to the chest, one to the abdomen. Close range. No sign of a struggle. The bullets were traced back to the sheriff's service weapon, the very tool he had sworn to use only in the line of duty. The DNA evidence told another story, a deeper betrayal. The results were pulled from the test that had started it all, confirming once again what John Miller had discovered that night. His 3 children were not his own. The truth that had pushed him over the edge was now the foundation of a double homicide case against him. The officers who had worked alongside him for years sat in disbelief. They had known John as a man of reason, a man of control. But now they had to put aside what they knew and treat him like any other suspect. Inside the interrogation room, John sat at the metal table, his hands still cuffed in front of him. The overhead light cast a harsh glow over his face. He didn't look angry. He didn't look defiant. He just sat there, staring at his hands, silent. Detectives entered, their movements careful, their voices measured. They knew they had to handle this differently. This wasn't just another criminal. This was someone who had once been one of them. "John," one of them said, taking a seat across from him. "Tell us what happened." He didn't speak. Another moment of silence. The hum of the air conditioner. The faint sound of voices outside the door. "John," the detective tried again, leaning forward. "Your kids called 911. They saw everything. Do you understand what that means?" A flicker of something crossed John's face. Pain? Regret? But still, he said nothing. "You know how this works, John. We're not just looking at one body. We're looking at 2. You didn't just kill Michael. You killed Sarah." Finally he spoke, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "She was part of it." The detectives exchanged glances. Part of what? John inhaled sharply, his shoulders rising and falling. "The lie. You mean the DNA test? That's why you did this." John's jaw tightened. His eyes finally lifted, meeting the detectives. And for the first time, there was something there. A spark of the man he had been before. A man who had built his life around rules, order, and justice. "It wasn't just the test," he murmured. "It was everything." The detective leaned in. "You planned this, John?" Another silence. Then, finally, a slow shake of his head. "No. But when I saw him, when I looked at her, I just knew. There was no other way." The confession was quiet, almost detached, like a man who had already accepted his fate. The interrogation continued, but there was no fight left in him. No anger. No excuses. Just a man who had lost everything and taken 2 lives in the process. As the detectives stepped out of the room, one of them exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Jesus." The other nodded. "Yeah. The law doesn't mean anything when the truth breaks a man like that." John Miller had spent his entire life putting criminals behind bars. And now he was about to take his place among them. During the trial, the courtroom was silent, yet the air was thick with tension. The trial of Sheriff John Miller wasn't just another murder case. It was the fall of a man once seen as the pillar of justice. A man who had sworn to uphold the law, now standing before a accused of breaking it in the most brutal way possible. Family members filled the gallery, their faces a mix of grief, anger, and disbelief. Former colleagues sat in silence, unable to reconcile the man they had once respected with the man now on trial for a double homicide. Reporters lined the back row, their pens scratching across notepads, knowing this case had already captured the nation's attention. And in the center of it all sat John Miller, his face blank, his hands clasped together as if in silent resignation. The state wasted no time laying out its case. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman with years of experience handling high-profile murders, stepped before the jury and spoke with precision. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the facts of this case are undeniable. John Miller walked into his brother's home. He pulled the trigger, twice. He then turned that same weapon on his wife. He was not under threat. He was not in danger. This was not self-defense. This was a man who made a choice to kill. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in. The defense may argue that this was a crime of passion, a man pushed to his limits. But let me be clear, rage does not excuse murder. Betrayal does not justify execution. And no man, regardless of his badge, is above the law. The jury listened intently. Some nodded in agreement. Others glanced toward John, trying to read his expression. But he gave them nothing. When the defense took the floor, the approach was different, measured, careful, almost pleading. This case is not about justice, John's attorney began. It's about tragedy. A tragedy that took a good man, a devoted husband, and a respected sheriff, and broke him beyond repair. He turned toward the jury, his voice softer but firm. You've heard the evidence. You've seen the DNA test that revealed the unthinkable. John Miller was not just betrayed. He was deceived in a way that stripped him of his very identity. His children, the ones he raised, the ones he believed were his own, were not. His wife, the woman he trusted, had lied to him for over a decade. His own brother, his flesh and blood, was the man who had stolen everything from him. He let the words linger before continuing. John Miller acted in a moment of insanity, temporary psychosis triggered by unimaginable emotional distress. His entire reality had shattered in an instant. He was not thinking. He was not in control. What happened that night was not premeditated murder. It was the breaking of a man pushed past his limits. The jury remained expressionless, but the weight of the argument was evident. Was this cold-blooded murder, or was it the inevitable consequence of a man whose world had been torn apart? One by one, the witnesses took the stand. Friends, family, experts. John's eldest child, barely old enough to understand the gravity of the trial, sat in the witness chair, his hands trembling. I called 911, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I heard the shots. I saw. He swallowed hard, unable to finish. The forensic psychologist was next, breaking down the psychological collapse of a man who had spent his entire life believing in justice, only to become the very thing he once condemned. When John Miller read those DNA results, it shattered his reality. Betrayal at this level, especially for a man whose entire identity was built around order and control, can lead to a dissociative break. In that moment, his brain could no longer process rational thought. He was operating purely on emotional instinct, in a state of temporary psychosis. The prosecution pushed back. But did he know what he was doing? The psychologist hesitated before answering. At the moment of the crime, I believe he was acting on impulse rather than intent. But he knew what he had done afterward. He surrendered. He understood the consequences. The courtroom murmured. That was the question, wasn't it? Could John Miller be held accountable if his mind had broken? Or did the fact that he willingly gave himself up prove that he knew, deep down, that he had done something unforgivable? The jury deliberated for hours. Every detail of the case was debated, every argument weighed. And then at last they returned. Will the defendant please rise? John stood, his face unreadable, his shoulders squared. In the case of the state versus John Miller, we, the jury, find the defendant. A pause. A moment where time seemed to stretch forever. Guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom erupted. Gasps. Murmurs. A wave of emotions rippling through the room. Some were relieved. He would pay for what he had done. Others were outraged. Second degree, not first? Did they believe it wasn't premeditated? The judge's voice cut through the noise. John Miller, you have been found guilty of second-degree murder. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. John didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He simply nodded, as if he had already accepted this fate long before the words had been spoken. As he was led out of the courtroom, he caught one last glimpse of his children. They didn't run to him. They didn't cry for him. They simply watched, their faces blank, their eyes distant. And he realized in that moment that his punishment had already begun. Do you think his sentence was fair? Comment below, and let's discuss. The clang of the prison door was final. The sound of metal against metal, locking Sheriff John Miller away from the world he once knew. From a respected lawman to a convicted murderer, his fall from grace was complete. The very system he once served had now become his new reality. He spends his days in a small, windowless cell, surrounded by walls that offer no escape from his thoughts. His past, his actions, his regrets, echoing in the silence of confinement. He does not protest his sentence. He does not fight for appeals. Perhaps, deep down, he believes this is where he belongs. A man who spent his life delivering justice now serves his own. John Miller remains behind bars, sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. He has not made any public statements since his trial, and according to prison officials, he keeps to himself, avoiding interactions with other inmates. The man who once commanded authority now lives in the shadows, just another number in the system. There are reports that he has been visited by a few former colleagues, officers who once saw him as a mentor, some out of curiosity, some perhaps out of pity. But the one thing he hoped for most, his children, has never come. They have not written. They have not visited. They have chosen, instead, to move forward without the man they once called Dad. The children, 3 innocent lives caught in the middle of a truth they never asked for, were placed in the custody of their maternal grandparents. Too young to fully process the depth of what happened, yet old enough to understand that their world had changed forever. They lost both their parents in a single night, one to violence, the other to the consequences of that violence. As they grew older, they distanced themselves from their past. They changed their last names, moved to another state, built lives where they were not the children of a murderer, not the tragic figures in a story that had captivated the media. But no matter how far they ran, the weight of that night still lingers. Some scars don't fade. Some truths can never be forgotten. Would they ever forgive the man who raised them? The man who, despite his actions, once loved them unconditionally? That answer remains unknown. In the end, this was not just a story about murder. It was a story about deception, about betrayal, about the power of truth and the destruction it can leave in its wake. Some truths are better left undiscovered. But for this sheriff, the truth wasn't just painful, it was deadly. Pushpin, if this story shocked you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the next case we're covering is even more unbelievable.